Welcome, everybody, all of the people whom I cannot see because I'm talking into a little green light. I'm Marcy Shore. I'm Associate Professor of History and Director of Graduate Studies for the European and Russian Studies MA program at the European Council at the MacMillan Center at Yale University. And I'm happy to welcome you to the keynote address today for our two-day virtual conference, as all conferences are these days, with the title Europe Today, Challenges and Opportunities. This conference involved 11 students on the planning committee. We have 45 graduate students and faculty representing some 24 institutions worldwide. Given that nobody is physically moving around these days, we can open it up easily to everybody. Thank you, all of you, for making this conference possible. I am now delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Radosław Sikorski. Mr. Sikorski is a member of the European Parliament for Poland and chair of the delegation for relations with the United States. He sits on the Committee for Foreign Affairs, the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and the Security and Defense Subcommittee. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard and distinguished statesman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He graduated from Oxford with a BA in politics, philosophy, and economics. Earlier in his career, those of you who are journalists will find this interesting, he served as a war correspondent in Afghanistan and Angola. He was previously Poland's Minister of Defense and also Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's the author of several books, most recently one titled Polska może być lepsza, Poland Can Be Better. I want to mention just two further things. In particular, in 2014, during what turned out to be the culmination of the Ukrainian Revolution on the Maidan, during a massacre, Radek sent out a little Twitter message, which I saw that came up on Gazeta Wyborcza, saying that he was on his way to Kiev. And Kiev at the moment was a kind of bloody mess during this revolution, and there was a sniper attack carried out on the side of the government, and there was the president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was hanging out in his presidential palace as people were being massacred some 200 meters away, and Radek went into the palace and negotiated a ceasefire with him, which involved, doing so without screaming, crying, throwing things, or otherwise becoming hysterical, which is not an easy task. And a day or so later, Yanukovych fled across the border to Russia and has rarely been seen since then. The Foreign Policy magazine recently named Radek one of 100 global policy intellectuals, citing his characteristic for which he is very well known, for speaking the truth even when it's not diplomatic. And I will maybe just add as an illustration of that, something from the cover of his recent book, Poland Can Be Better, which is, are we heading towards a geopolitical catastrophe? We're supposed to be proud of the fact that we have gotten up from our knees while not noticing that we've fallen on our head. Okay, and with that, I am very pleased to turn you over to Mr. Radosław Sikorski.
Thank you very much. Regards from New York, where I happen to be. Congratulations on your Polish pronunciation, Marcy, and thank you for the generous introduction. Very grateful to be invited by the European Studies Council and the MacMillan Center at Yale, particularly given that, as Marcy said, I'm a Harvard senior scholar. The friendship between Yale and Harvard is well known the world over. But I do have a great deal of sympathy for Yale as well, and I think there are a couple of Yale graduates of my acquaintance that that are listening in on us, and I'd like to say hello to Harvey Applebaum, class of 1959, my father-in-law, and Anna Applebaum, class of 1986. and Alexander Sikorski, class of 2020, who didn't unfortunately get his commencement. So hello, and first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your choice of panels. And you are the first conference in my conscience that has had a panel on East European migration to Central Europe. That's due to happen tomorrow. Congratulations. I think this is going to become an interesting political fact in future and needs to be discussed. The topic before us is Europe today, challenges and opportunities. You say Europe, which of course is a bigger concept than the European Union, but I will take it to mean the European Union, challenges and opportunities. And I think before we plunge into the subject, we need to define what the European Union is, because there is a great deal of misunderstanding. I think partly Brexit was due to the fact that the British public was for decades misled about what the European Union was and what it stood for. And I think many Americans, not only because they get their information from the British, but because we all have a tendency to make parallels with one's own situation, tend to think that the European Union is a kind of NAFTA, North Atlantic Free Trade Association or agreement. And this is not so. The European Union is not a free trade area. It's also not an international organization. And the British are actually discovering the difference between a free trade area and a single market. Free trade area, like the one you have with Canada and Mexico, means that there are the tariffs on many goods are zero. Single market means frictionless trade, that goods flow freely without any checks or bureaucratic encumbrances. A single market is a much more ambitious project and requires a much deeper integration of legal systems of the countries that participate in them. Europe is also mostly a single currency area. The euro is the currency of the European Union, although not all member states have yet acceded to it. For example, my country, Poland, has pledged itself to join the Eurozone. What's not specified is the date and the rate of exchange. And the European Union is not an international organization. It is sometimes treated as such by some members, but by some states and by some other international organizations, but that is not its nature. The European Union is a confederation with some federal features. I'll come back to it again, but this is important to remember. Ultimate sovereignty lies with the member states, and you may leave, as the British have showed. But when member states really don't want to do something, there is no central authority that can force them to do so. There are some federal features, most notably in the area of trade. When it comes to trade agreements, be it with Britain or Japan that we recently entered into, or with the United States that we've been negotiating on and off, member states are not part of the negotiations. Member states have passed on the exclusive power to make trade treaties to the European Commission. In that sense, the European Commission is sovereign in making those agreements. And this comes from the calculation that as a single market of 450 million rich consumers, an economy of $17 trillion at current exchange rates, $20 trillion at purchasing power parity. We get a much better deal than if we negotiated as single member states. And I think the British will soon realize that even though their deal may be more precise, size doesn't matter. A couple more statistics, because I think it's important to keep things in proportion. Our per capita average income is $44,000. There are varieties between over 100,000 in Luxembourg and something like 28,000 in Bulgaria. But overall, we are a continent that is where income inequalities are moderate. And that proves to be an element of resilience and a good thing on the whole. Before you believe Europhobes in how bureaucratic the European Union is, just remember that this huge continental confederation is run by 40,000 bureaucrats. That's less than the city of London or Paris and many other similar cities. The cost of this administration is under 6% of the total funds administered. Find me an NGO or a ministry that has those kinds of costs. And the funds that the EU disposes of, and that includes agricultural subsidies, cohesion funds, which are spent on improving infrastructure in poorer regions, all of that is at the moment 1% of the total GDP of the European Union. We are now debating whether to increase it to 2%, but at the moment it's 1%. And one more thing about the nature of the EU that I want to convey to you, because this is such a perennial subject of disinformation and misinformation, is how EU directives are arrived at. If you listen to Europhobes, whether in Britain or inside the European Union, you would think that the European Commission in secret cabals thinks them up and then imposes them on member states. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is true that the Commission sometimes proposes directives. Usually it happens at the request of the Council. Council, which is the body where heads of government are represented. The EU is essentially run by three bodies. The Commission, with commissioners appointed by the member states, the Council, heads of government, and the European Parliament, of which I'm a member, members of Parliament, democratically elected in their constituencies in the member states. And so, for example, a controversial directive on the banning of 100-watt traditional bulbs. Well, it was first the Council, the member states, that requested the Commission to prepare a draft. The Commission prepared it. And then you need the agreement of all these three bodies, usually in the process of so-called trialogue, for the directive to become law, which is ultimately passed by the European Parliament. And to tell you frankly, I can't imagine how this could be made more democratic. Because surely unanimity in the European Parliament can't be the rule, because that's not how we operate our democratic politics in our member states. You just need a majority. And in the Council, where the member states are represented, on most things we do have unanimity. On some things we do it by a supermajority. You need majority of member states representing the majority of population, which also seems to me to be sensible. And then, of course, once we have passed such a directive, then it is obligatory to translated into national legislation, and then also to comply with it. And if a country is found in breach of the directive, then the Commission can impose fines that are up to hundreds of thousands of euros per day. But yes, once you've passed a law, it has to be obeyed. Let me finish this segment by just saying what the powers of the European Parliament are. We are somewhat different from national parliaments. The one prerogative we don't have is to initiate legislation. This is, in most countries, theoretical. For example, in Poland or in Britain and many other countries, individual members of parliament or groups of parliamentarians can initiate a bill, but very rarely do those bills make it through the whole process. In most countries, to get a law passed, you need the backing of the government. You need the working majority that a government has. And most laws in most countries are initiated by the ruling party, which commands majority in parliament. So we don't have this theoretical right, but in most other respects, we are like a national parliament. We take part in the passing of directives, as I've already mentioned. We have to ratify trade agreements. And that means that we are included in the process of the negotiation. And sometimes we reject them. For example, at the moment, we will be considering our investment agreement with China. And this is hugely controversial, and its passing is very doubtful now that China has sanctioned some of my colleagues. We also approve the appointment of the Commission, and we can do it either the Commission as a whole or individual commissioners. And we approve the EU budget, and we've just gone through a convoluted but ultimately successful process of agreeing a 7-year budget. We also passed the annual budgets of the EU, and that gives us also a great deal of influence on policy. Now, challenges and opportunities. I will start with challenges. The biggest current one is obviously the pandemic. And here we are, I would say, moderately successful. We have not been as fast at vaccinating our people as Israel and the UK or even the US, but we have just passed the 100 million mark, which means that almost a quarter of our population has been vaccinated. I will say two things in defense of the EU, even though there is widespread dissatisfaction at the pace. First of all, remember, when the pandemic broke out a year ago, we were in danger of a much worse situation. And there were some unfortunate incidents of, for example, masks and respirators, where they were most needed at that time in Lombardy, in Italy, being stopped at some nation states who were hoarding this equipment. And the Commission intervened on the grounds of the single market, and the equipment started flowing again. Then we had uncoordinated closures of borders between member states. And now, again, the Schengen group is coordinating and exchanging information, and less inconvenience is being caused. And what was the biggest danger for the EU was vaccine nationalism inside the European Union. Countries bidding against one another and getting all the vaccines for their own people first, and denying them to other members of the EU. And this we have avoided by procuring the vaccines together by the Commission making the purchases on our own or on behalf of us all. And that, of course, meant some time for coordination and for getting things rolling. And then perhaps the one place where we could have done better is the Commission put a premium on price. So we got our vaccine a third, or even in some cases 2/3 cheaper than the British. And our contracts stipulated that the companies would do their best to supply them, to fulfill the contracts, which under common law meant obligation, under Roman law meant recommendation. So actually some third countries got some of our vaccines. The vaccines continued to be exported from the EU while other people were needing them. This has now come to a stop. So we've done moderately well in an area which was not a province of the EU at all. Health has always been the province of the member states. So the public has demanded EU action, the EU has stepped in, has done reasonably well. We need to integrate ourselves better in this area in the future. We need to have common European standards for the minimum amounts of active ingredients or of crucial equipment or of supply chains inside the European Union, and we are working on it. I think we'll be much better prepared for a next future health emergency. The second challenge is populism, both internal and external. This is not a Central European problem, it's a pan-European problem. We've had populists in power in Italy. We have a populist party and a populist candidate for the presidency of France, polling at 48%. We've had populists in power in Hungary for a long time. In Poland, they gained power with 38% of the vote back in 2015. They're now at around 30%. But this is a challenge all across the Western world. In the United States, President Trump never got the majority of the popular vote, so in Europe he would never have got elected. But 70 million Americans voted for him again. And I believe we've had these waves of populism in the Western world before. In the United States, at the end of the 19th century, you've had the silver currency movement. We've had populisms of the left and of the right in Europe in the 1930s, and we have them today. And I believe that a sensible establishment takes whatever is rational and sensible in populist demands and tries to address the real grievance of which there is usually a sensible call. Populism proposes simple solutions to complex problems. We need to propose effective solutions to complex problems. One of which, and this is my next challenge, is migration. I've already mentioned migration east to west, which I think is part of the solution. But of course, the main problem was south to north, which is a very difficult problem, both in the US and in Europe. In Europe, much bigger on two counts. Number one, it's much harder to make someone into a European than into an American for reasons that you know, and also in Northern Africa and the Greater Middle East, there is about 1 billion people who'd rather live in a high welfare society such as ours, and rule of law society such as ours, than in a low welfare or no law or no state society, such as is often the case in where they are now. And you cannot have a high welfare area and an open border, because it just doesn't work. So we need a sensible discussion about acceptable rates of migration, acceptable rules of migration, acceptable rates of absorption, and acceptable ways of making migrants into productive and constructive citizens. And because on both of our continents, this discussion was for some time delegalized, particularly by the left, if I may be frank, and branded as racist, the problem swelled. And we need to convince our people that that we are not in favor of open borders, which they correctly see as a threat to our way of life. And we need to have rules, and we need to convince people that we are in control of our external perimeter. You cannot have, under the Schengen Agreement, free movement of people inside the European Union if you don't have effective control over the external border of the area. And this is the prerogative of every nation state, sovereign state, or a group of states, as in this case. The fourth challenge, I would say, is security. The organizing principle of the rest of this half of the century will probably be the competition between the United States and China for world primacy. We cannot exclude that either over Taiwan or South China Sea, the conflict between the US and China becomes kinetic. This might not be the US's choice, it might be China's choice. China officially says it will unite with Taiwan by 2049 by whatever means. And if and when that happens, this is something that will command all the attention and all the resources of the United States. And therefore, Europe needs by that time to develop its own security policy, its own insurance policy, its own ability to deter fragmented enemies of our way of life in the south, and a revisionist Russia to our east. And therefore, we need a defense policy worthy of its name. At the moment, we are not serious. We have passed a defense budget in this multi-annual budget for the first time, but it's only about €1 billion per annum for the whole continent. And you can't have a serious defense policy for that. It needs to be much bigger, and we need to pool our resources and our procurement policies so as to avoid duplication in Europe to a much greater extent. In the security sphere, the challenge is also ideological. It's us, democracies, versus autocracies such as Russia or China. We've named it a systemic rivalry. And the EPP, my party in the European Parliament, European People's Party, the largest party there, has accepted as its policy the document that I prepared on policy towards China, where I argue that we need to trade and collaborate with China where possible. We need to compete with China where needed, but we also need to confront China where necessary. And that means, for example, we will maintain our arms embargo on China, and it also means that we need to collaborate with the United States and other democracies on rule setting in AI, in transfer of data, of technologies, in coming and going investments, in the way that research is done on animals, on people, on culling of data, and so on. We can come back to that. And lastly, our challenge is to grow faster, because we've been lagging behind the United States, not to mention China. And for that, we need to complete our single market in the area of services, and we need to invest properly in emerging technologies such as AI, quantum, and hydrogen. And of course, investing is one thing, getting outcomes proportional to the investment is another. Let me now turn to opportunities, and there are several. First of all, I think we are the only place in the world where sensible rules on cyber, on data privacy, on the way that data is used, and the way social media operate, where these rules can be set with the view to the balance between the needs of industry and the rights of citizens. China won't do it, Russia won't do it, and I am afraid that your Congress has also been captured by special interests to such an extent that you probably won't do it either. And we find it easier because these tech companies are not ours, they're yours in the United States. So we have more autonomy in setting it, and it's almost too late to do it. Not only because our data are misused, but because our democracies are being undermined by the misuse of these technologies. It's not just trolling, it's not just cyber attacks, it's the very way that the algorithms of the social media are shaped to set us against each other, one another, to throw us at one another's throats. The algorithms make money for their owners when they get us to spend more time in front of our laptops. And what keeps us there is controversy. But we can regulate the algorithms themselves so that they foster civilized debate, such as the one we are, I hope, about to have. This can be done. There are some very interesting experiments in Taiwan and elsewhere on how this could be done, and we really need it. It shouldn't be up to owners of companies to decide whether the President of the United States can participate in public discussion through the major medium of debate in the Western world. He should have been banned a long time ago, but it shouldn't have been Mark Zuckerberg's decision to do so. And in Europe, we can do this. Europe, in collaboration with the United States, is also the place which can lead on modernizing our global taxation system so that multinationals, not only tech, pay their fair share of taxation for the physical and human infrastructure from which they draw their benefits. I'm a very pro-business kind of person, but companies should pay some taxes somewhere. And together with the United States, if there is a will, we can get rid of tax havens, and we can ban them, and we can tax and recover 50 trillion euros that is hidden away in those jurisdictions, and we can use that money to fight the pandemic, to fight the recession, and for the benefit of our population. Europe is also going to lead the world in energy transformation, and our recovery fund is specifically targeted for our health services, for digitalization and energy transformation. And if we can get cheap green energy, then that will be a competitive edge that we gain by comparison with other power centers. We can also make ourselves wealthier if we complete monetary union and make the euro a reserve currency with all the benefits of seigniorage from that, free loans from the rest of the world, which has benefited the United States so much over the decades. And we could also gain autonomy from other countries' extraterritorial taxation if we make the euro a serious currency. And lastly, if we conduct our foreign policy jointly, like we pledged ourselves to do in the Lisbon Treaty, we will be one of the 3 biggest global power centers on a par proportional to our economic might with the United States and China. If we don't stick together, we will be played apart even by Russia and even by smaller countries, member states being played off one another. Let me spend the last few minutes of my remarks by just returning to the issue that might derail all those opportunities. And this is constitutional, because we are a confederation. We are what the United States were between the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. The US fought its war with the British as a confederation. You had a continental Congress and a continental army, but it was up to the states to provide resources, to provide troops, to provide ammunition, and you almost lost that war because it was so unreliable. And George Washington and others saw this, and that's why they pressed for a federation, a constitution, and it was under the pooling of debts, your Hamiltonian moment, that finally made your union inseparable, because you assumed responsibility for one another, and ultimately was resolved by, of course, the War of Secession. We are currently convening a conference on the future of Europe, because all known historic confederations have either become federations like the US, like Switzerland and others, or they have collapsed. So if we want to achieve all those things that I've been talking about, we need to do the exact opposite of what Europhobes demand, not make the center even weaker than it is. We need to make the center stronger. If we are to influence some of the decisions and some of the shortages of rule of law inside some member states and inside some countries, we need greater powers to do so. And we are doing it through the system of peer review. In the Eurozone, members compare and comment on one another's budgets. And we have now committed ourselves to a similar mechanism in the rule of law. The Commission reviews the rule of law of all the member states semi-annually, and we then tell members, look, you need to be communitaire, you need to be a member in good standing, you need to address your shortages. But ultimately, I subscribe to a slogan coined by a British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, whose idea was that the European Union should not become a super state, but it should be a superpower. And if we are to be a superpower that can take part in the global division of respect, of rulemaking, of power, then we need to to go further and to persuade our people that some more sovereign powers need to be put together. I hope this answers the question on the balance of challenges and opportunities for the European Union, and I hope I've convinced you that our direction of travel is the correct one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm feeling better about the European Union already. And I'm going to let you take your own questions from the chat, unless you start to feel overwhelmed, in which case just let me know and I'll feed some to you.
Mr. Piotr Kopinski has asked, do you think the COVID pandemic will inspire a new federal feature of EU in either healthcare or science I think I've mentioned it already, that it is already doing so. We have committed ourselves to common minimum standards in, for example, pools of respirators and of active ingredients of our medicines. There is just like in the US, a realization that we have subcontracted and delegated offshore too many crucial capabilities. And some of you may have noticed that, for example, India has decided to restrict exports. And we've had to, at some stages, rely on masks from China. I mean, surgical mask is something we can make in the European Union. We shouldn't be dependent on this stuff. On faraway countries whose deliveries might be delayed by a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. So yes, this is going to happen, and our science financing is already reflecting this change of priorities, and there's a huge groundswell of demand from our people to do so. And I think it's a perfect illustration of a method by Europhobes. At the beginning of the pandemic, Europhobes were saying the EU is failing. And these were the same people who jealously guarded health as being a national prerogative, which is their classic argument. They don't give the EU powers to act in some area, and then they blame the EU for not succeeding. And I think we need a consensus on this. Of course, it shouldn't go too far. But for example, we have created a special commission on cancer, and resources will be pooled to give all Europeans a minimum standard of protection and of help in cancer treatment, and I think this is completely non-controversial. Mr. Mark Ibanez Diaz is asking, how can we finish with authoritarian populism in Poland and Hungary? Well, this is not just Poland and Hungary, as I've already argued. The one that has the biggest destructive potential is actually France, because if Marine Le Pen wins in France, then I fear for the very survival of the European Union. And in Poland, I think the populist wave has already peaked. The ruling populist party is now 30 and below in the opinion polls, and they are in danger of losing their small majority in parliament. They don't seem to have a majority, for example, to vote through the ratification of the recovery fund, and we might have a government crisis around that. Hungary, of course, is further down the line because Fidesz has been in power for much longer. They've changed the rules, some of them constitutionally, some not. We have expelled Fidesz from the EPP. but they are very close to constructing the kind of system in which the government can't lose. You know, the simplest definition of democracy is a system in which the government can lose. But if you have most of the media, if you use the financial and economic power of the state to help your party members and your sympathizers, and if you structure the voting systems themselves to suit your circumstances, then of course it's the playing field is not level. If you look at ODIHR, the OSCE arm which monitors elections around the world, which is actually based in Warsaw, and which actually monitored your own presidential election recently. It makes two kinds of reports. The short-term report on the day of voting and then on the days of counting. But there is also a long-term report many weeks before the vote, which describes the ecosystem in which an election takes place. And democracy is not just the honest counting of votes on the day. Democracy is an ecosystem in which a competitive election takes place. And so in both countries, the ecosystem is damaged. But I think Poland is still recoverable. Hungary is harder, but the opposition there has united and they've won many of the contests in local elections, and I think they are now neck and neck with the government. So, so there is some hope there. But ultimately, in a confederation, the outside world and Brussels can only encourage them. I mean, these are problems we have to solve at home. Anonymous viewer is asking me, can you please elaborate on what you meant by saying migration from the East is part of the solution? The Polish populist government sometimes says, well, we are not anti-migration populists. Look, we have 1 million Ukrainians in Poland. And yes, it's true, we have 1 million Ukrainians in Poland, but those are people on temporary work visas, which are a national prerogative. We also have, I think, probably over 100,000 Belarusians now. Actually, paradoxically, the PiS government has granted tens of thousands of work visas to Nepalis, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis for the first time in Poland's history. And they, have the illusion, such as Western Europeans had in the 50s and 60s, that these people will, because they're on temporary visas, that they will somehow go back home. I doubt it. But I think the Ukrainian migration, which is the biggest, has saved temporarily Poland's pension system, because these are young, energetic, mostly quite educated people who are paying into our pension system without drawing from it. Of course, eventually they retire and they'll draw from it too, but in the short run, the deficit in our pension system is much less than it would otherwise be. So, and that helps government finances. And also Poland's economy is still doing well. We have a recession for last year, first in 30 years, but it is much shallower than in the EU as a whole. The EU as a whole is over 8%, and we are just over 4%. And this year there should be dynamic growth, and we have labor shortages. So this is helping it. And of course, Ukrainian Belarusians are culturally completely compatible, and we don't expect any of the usual problems that Western Europeans have. Elena Adasheva-Klein is asking a very interesting question, namely, what is the role of Europe in the Arctic, considering current international competition for resources and transportation routes between US, Russia, and China? I think the closure of the Suez Canal should fix our minds on this amazing opportunity in the north. And the Russians have been treating this seriously, both in the defense field. I mean, Russia is claiming part of the shelf all the way up to the North Pole, which is absurd, but has been positioning troops up in the north. But also, Russia has been financing search and rescue facilities and improving their port facilities on the northern shore of Russia facing the Arctic, with the hope that as global temperatures rise, the northern route would become available for longer and longer periods, parts of the year. Last I checked, it was only hundreds of ships per annum, as opposed to tens of thousands via Suez per annum. But the growth has been incredibly dynamic. And of course, shipment times from, say, Germany to Japan via the northern route are even faster than via Suez. So this is something to watch. So far as I know, Norway and Russia have resolved their territorial disputes in the continental shelf. But yes, I think the Arctic Council and the struggle for both resources and transportation rights is something to watch very carefully in the future. We have 8 more minutes, I understand. Riley Constable is asking, the United Kingdom has been vaccinating their citizens against COVID at a rate much faster than the EU. At a time when COVID is at the front of everyone's mind, how do European leaders prevent this obvious fact from making European citizens more Eurosceptic? Well, I've talked about it before. Perhaps it was a mistake to put a premium on price rather than speed, because it was worth paying almost any price to put our economy back to normal. But it's a bit rich question coming from the UK, because the UK has been vaccinating faster because we didn't stop the export from vaccines made in the European Union. The British have been, part of the vaccines that the British have been vaccinating themselves faster comes from us. So this shows how friendly and law-abiding we are. And I think it's actually changing right now, because we've now read the Riot Act to the companies, and we've told them, we will not let you export until you fulfill your contracts to us on time. So, you know, two sides can play that game. We've avoided, and the idea that Brexit has worked because the British are vaccinating faster is absurd. Britain was in its right to go the national way on vaccines while a member of the European Union. In emergencies, this is allowed. There was no need to leave the European Union to do this. And this is a false argument, one of many such false arguments against the European Union over many decades. I'm not sure about Claude Everett's question. I'm not sure I get it, but Mr. Adam Marszalec is asking about Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is indeed lobbied by Germany and Russia, and as an issue that can fracture the European Union. I doubt it. It is a very controversial issue, and I've been warning our German friends and allies not to do it for years, already back in 2006. It's an issue on which Germany and some other countries, including Netherlands and others, are participating in the construction of Nord Stream. They've put their economic interest, access to cheap Russian gas, and the right to build this facility over the geopolitical interest over the entire EU and the economic interest of countries that are now transit countries for Russian gas, namely primarily Slovakia, Czechia, Poland to some extent, and certainly Ukraine, for which the transit fees from Druzhba have amounted to about €1.5 billion per annum. The US is now facilitating whether to support Germany or Central Europe on this, and whether to make the sanctions stick and prevent the completion of the pipeline or not. The existence of the European Union has not abolished the difference in interest between their member states. I just wish that those adversely affected had put together a more effective blocking coalition for what Germany and others have tried to do on this issue. And I hope Germany finds a way of not harming those who are going to lose by this investment. I don't think it has the potential to destroy the European Union, but it certainly has undermined trust and is a niggling issue between member states. Thank you for your compliments. Mr. Callum Wall, is it not undemocratic for the EU to set directives and punish elected national governments which do not obey the bloc? Well, Mr. Callum Wall obviously didn't listen from the beginning of my speech, because he has repeated and often made misrepresentation of how directives are made. This is simply not true, that directives are set by undemocratic EU and imposed on the members of the bloc. The speech has been recorded. I hope you go back to the beginning of my speech, but please don't repeat such disinformation, because it's this sort of stuff that has made the British leave the EU, and I don't think it's been beneficial for them. I have pledged myself in Poland to do my utmost to counter such disinformation. Because the tragedy in Britain was that politicians didn't have the guts to answer this Europhobic nonsense, these Europhobic lies, and that's why they got the result that they did. Anonymous viewer, what is your prognosis for Russian democracy in the long term? I mean, I'm a great sympathizer with the people's aspiration, both in Iran or in Russia, to have a more democratic polity. But I have to say that in countries such as Iran and Russia, the sociological base for democracy is small. It is much smaller than we thought, both in Europe and the United States. We have just seen that even in the US, a sizable proportion of the population was willing to back an anti-democratic coup. And in Europe also, sizable proportions of our democracies, if given the choice between effectiveness and democracy, would choose effectiveness. And I think we have to be humble about this. You know, in some countries, there's a perception that Chinese-style authoritarianism is more effective, and this will be attractive to some people. You know, the victory over communism was not only because the West was democratic, it was because democracy was seen to provide economic success. And we need to restore this, this presumption to democracy. And in Poland, as I've had to acknowledge, the population is split about half and half between European-style democracy and more and less democratic attitudes. And in Russia, I fear the sociological base for democracy is between 20–25%. The majority of the population has been successfully brainwashed through generations into supporting an imperialist populist center at the cost of democracy. I hope it changes, and I'll be the first to welcome it. I've been criticized in my own country for saying that we should encourage Russia to aspire to our institutions, such as NATO and the EU. But my argument is that if Russia aspired to it, she would have to fulfill the criteria. And the criteria are to become a democracy. And that would be a good thing for Russia's neighbors, including Poland. We have many more questions, but I fear that my time has run out. Marcy, what do you say?
You can take one more if you like.
Okay, let's have one final one. We have Mr. Andrzej Woziński on carbon border taxation, but I'm not an expert on this. Magdalena Kalisiak on climate change. On this, I can just tell you that we have set ourselves an incredibly ambitious goal of a 55% reduction of our emissions by 2030, which is just around the corner. And perhaps I'll stop by answering Aya Marczuk's question about the future of independent media in Poland, because this is an issue which is literally on the cusp now. The populist Polish government is trying to use our petrochemical company, Orlen, the way Putin used Gazprom, to buy up independent media, even overpaying. And they can overpay because it's not their money. So the way Gazprom bought TV stations, Orlen, a state-controlled company, has just bought the largest grouping of regional newspapers. The largest independent TV station in Poland, called TVN, has also been approached to sell its news operation to state-controlled entities. This is how they want to do it. This is the Putin, Orban, Erdogan playbook from which the Polish government is playing. And the question is, will they succeed by the time of the next election? And they're trying to do that, and we should stop them. And I hope owners of these media don't sell, and I hope anti-monopoly authorities, both in Poland and in the European Union, also play their role. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Radek Sikorski. Thank you to all of you for listening. And I very much hope that this discussion will continue at some point in person when this dystopian era ends. And I'm looking forward to that moment. And I'm feeling more optimistic about Europe and to some extent about the world than I was an hour ago. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody, and stay well.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.